Khartoum, Sudan's capital, was a city where life seemed to flow like the confluence of the Blue and White Nile River. Over 6 million people live here, their livelihoods shaped by bustling markets, thriving trade routes, and a history rich in cultural diversity. People came from far and wide, eager to see the heart of Sudan, witness its majestic skyline, and enjoy the warm embrace of its welcoming people. But all of that came crashing down on April 15, 2023. The quiet hum of life was violently shattered when the first shot rang out. Khartoum's residents were jolted awake by the deafening sounds of gunfire and the warning rumbles of explosions. Buildings, once symbols of prosperity, now crumbled under the weight of bombs and artillery. Within moments, the city descended into chaos as war erupted across the streets. Families fled for their lives as over 12 million people were displaced by this sudden wave of violence. The city was unrecognizable, its once vibrant heartbeats now replaced by the roar of conflict. This is the war few knew about, the war that has claimed the lives of thousands, displaced millions, and altered the course of a nation. In this video, we'll take you into the inside story of Sudan's crisis, a story marked by power struggles, greed, and interference from outside forces. A story that has torn apart families, erased communities, and erased the very fabric of a once thriving nation. How did we get here? What's the true cause of this war? And who is really pulling the strings behind the scenes? This may be one of the worst wars you have never heard about, but by the end of this video, you'll understand why it's impossible to ignore. To understand the magnitude of Sudan's crisis, we need to take a step back. Who are the people feeling the weight of this war? Why has this tragedy unfolded? The scale is staggering. Over 7 million people now displaced within Sudan's borders. But the roots of this conflict stretch back centuries, far beyond the events of 2023. The tale begins with a man who set the stage for Sudan's modern-day challenges, Omar al-Bashir. But to truly grasp how Sudan became a powder keg of unrest, we must first rewind the clock to a time before the world knew of Omar al-Bashir or his reign. Sudan's story doesn't begin with its modern independence in 1956, or even the establishment of the country as we know it. No, it begins with a far older tale, a time long before the European borders were drawn on African maps. This land was once home to the mighty kingdom of Kush, a rival to the Egyptian empire, known for its strength and ambition. By 750 BC, under the leadership of King Pir, the Kushites did the unthinkable. They marched northwards, took control of Egypt's Great Pyramids, and ruled as pharaohs. The Kushite kings established what is now called the 25th dynasty, known as the Black Pharaohs. Their legacy is still seen in the pyramids of Meroe, which interestingly enough outnumber Egypt's pyramids. This ancient kingdom and its far-reaching influence are often overlooked, but the echoes of Kush still shape the identity of Sudan today. The Kushite Empire did not last forever. It was eventually defeated by the Assyrians, but the rich cultural and political history of Sudan continued to evolve. Fast forward several centuries, Sudan had transformed into a crossroads of African and Arab civilizations. The 7th century saw the arrival of Islam, carried by the merchants and warriors from the north. Over time, Sudan's identity morphed into something uniquely its own, blending African and Arab influences into a complex and distinct culture. By the 19th century, however, Sudan was no longer a prosperous kingdom, but a prize to be fought over. The Ottomans, under the Egyptian representatives, took control of Sudan, extracting gold, ivory, and most tragically, slaves. For decades, Sudan was exploited, and oppressed under this colonial rule, setting the stage for the internal conflict that will come later. This foreign domination did not sit well with the Sudanese people, and it ignited a fire that would lead to one of the most pivotal uprisings in African history. In the 1880s, a man named Mohamed Ahmad, who would come to be known as the Mahdi, rose to power. Claiming to be the redeemer of Islam, the Mahdi led his followers into a relentless jihad against the Ottoman Egyptian rulers. His army, the Ansar, swept across Sudan, defeating the Anglo-Egyptian forces with shocking speed. In 1885, they even killed British General Charles Gordon at the Battle of Khartoum, giving Sudan a brief moment of freedom. For a time, Sudan was under the rule of Mahdi state, a state born out of a movement of liberation and self-determination. But this freedom was short-lived. In 1898, Britain returned with a vengeance, equipped with machine guns and backed by a massive army. The Battle of Omdurman was a massacre, and the Mahdi's forces were decimated. Sudan was once again thrust under foreign rule, this time by the British. The British took control of Sudan as an Anglo-Egyptian colony, further deepening the divisions within the country. They split Sudan into two distinct regions, the largely Arab Muslim north and the predominantly black Christian and anime south. This divide and rule policy set the stage for decades of conflicts and tension that would erupt into civil wars of the 20th century. In 1952, as the Egyptian revolution ignited hope for independence, Sudan found itself on the cliff of a major change. The Egyptian monarchy was overthrown, and Egypt's new leaders saw a pathway to break free from the chains of British control. In their eyes, the only way to sever the colonial grip on Sudan was to relinquish their claim to sovereignty over the land. But this decision wasn't made lightly, and certainly not with the approval of all parties involved. Sudan was, at that point, a single administrative region, north and south, woven together in a delicate strained alliance. As the British prepared to leave, political power was largely handed to the northern elites, who shared cultural, religious, and political ties with Egypt. The South, a minority with a distinct African and Christian roots, was left unheard and unrepresented. The absence of consultation with Southern leaders ignited a firestorm of tension. The result, the day Sudan officially gained its independence in 1956, the nation was already tottering on the brink of civil war. How could leaders unite a nation that had been divided for so long? The North, with its Arab and Islamic identity, envisioned a unified Sudan in its image. Meanwhile, the Southern population, fearing domination, longed for autonomy. By 1955, the explosive clash of these two identities led to the Sudan's first civil war, a brutal conflict that would drag on for 17 years. A fragile peace was eventually brokered in 1972, but it was clear peace in Sudan was nothing more than an illusion. As the 1980s dawned, Sudan was still reeling from the scares of its first civil war. But in 1983, a new and defining moment would alter the country's course. The government in Khartoum, now more authoritarian than ever, imposed Islamic Sharia law across Sudan, without any distinction between the North and the South. This move, seen as a direct attack on the Southern Christian population, was the spark that reignited the flames of conflict. The Second Sudanese Civil War began, and it would grow to become one of the longest and deadliest conflicts in modern history, lasting more than 2 decades. Amidst the political chaos and war, a figure emerged who would shape Sudan's future: Omar al-Bashir. In 1989, Sudan was at its lowest point, battered by a failing economy and rampant instability. The democratic government, led by Prime Minister Sadiq al-Mahdi, was crumbling under the weight of internal strife. The military, disillusioned with the government's instability to restore order, took action. One fateful morning in June, as the airwaves went silent, tanks rumbled through the streets of Khartoum. By the time the radio crackled back to life, a deep voice declared that the government had fallen. The man behind the coup was none other than Lieutenant Colonel Omar al-Bashir, a man who would go on to shape Sudan's fate for the next 3 decades. At first glance, al-Bashir was a quiet figure, a little-known officer in Sudan's military. Yet his meteoric rise to power would transform him into one of Africa's most notorious dictators. Born in 1944, in a small village in northern Sudan, al-Bashir's path to power was built on military discipline and ambition. A soldier by nature, he had fought in the 1973 war against Israel and spent years in Sudan's military ranks, including assignments to the front lines in the brutal south. When he seized control in 1989, al-Bashir presented himself as a solution to Sudan's crumbling state. His rhetoric was familiar, promising stability, peace, and an end to corruption. But beneath the surface, darker forces were at play. Al-Bashir's rise was not just about restoring order, it was about reshaping Sudan in his image, and in the image of radical Islam. Behind him stood Hassan al-Turabi, a firebrand Islamist ideologue who envisioned Sudan as a theocratic state. Al-Turabi, the true architect of Sudan's Islamic authoritarianism, saw al-Bashir as the figurehead of his vision, a vision that would drag Sudan into an era of terror and repression. As al-Bashir consolidated power, his eyes were fixed on one thing: victory in the war against the South. For 16 years, Sudan's government waged a savage campaign against the Sudan's People Liberation Army. But the true horrors of al-Bashir's reign would unfold in Sudan's western region, Darfur. In 2003, a rebellion erupted, led by groups from Darfur's African ethnic minorities. The four, Masalites and Zagawa people, accused the Arab-dominated government of neglect and systematic marginalization. Al-Bashir's response was brutal, swift, and devastating. He unleashed a militia known as Janjaweed to crush the rebellion. The Janjaweed, supported by the Sudanese military forces, went on rampage through Darfur. Villages were burned to the ground. Civilians were massacred. Women were raped in horrific targeted campaigns. The Sudanese Air Force bombed refugee camps. It was a campaign of ethnic cleansing, and by the time the war began to take notice, over 300,000 people had already died, and millions more had been displaced. The international community reacted with horror, yet nothing substantial was done to halt the violence. The United Nations labeled it ethnic cleansing, but al-Bashir remained untouchable. The United States went further, calling it genocide. Still, al-Bashir's grip on power remained firm. In 2009, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for al-Bashir, making him the first sitting head of state ever to be charged with genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. But inside Sudan, he remained a powerful and untouchable figure, his reign extending for decades as his nation sank deeper into chaos. This was Sudan under Omar al-Bashir, a country torn apart by war, genocide, and unchecked ambitions of a leader driven by power at any cost. And as the world turned a blind eye, the nightmare only deepened. In the wake of his rising power, al-Bashir knew he needed something more than just military strength to maintain control over Sudan. He had a vision, one where his regime would be upheld not just by guns but by wealth. And so, he transformed his militia into something far more potent, the Rapid Support Forces, RSF. These fighters, led by the ruthless Hemedti, became the backbone of al-Bashir's rule. But beneath the surface, a darker transformation was unfolding. The RSF wasn't just about enforcing the government's will. It had evolved into a powerful, profitable enterprise. The group plunged into Sudan's gold mines, setting up an illegal gold trade that brought in massive profits. The RSF didn't stop there. It was involved in smuggling operations, border patrols, and even selling its services to foreign powers. Russia and the UAE, keen on their own geopolitical interests, were some of the high-profile clients in this shady operation. Meanwhile, Hemedti, the warlord turned businessman, amassed a fortune that rivaled the country's wealthiest elites. His influence grew rapidly, but in 2011, when South Sudan broke away and took most of Sudan's oil with it, things took a dark turn. The loss of 75% of the country's oil revenue sent Sudan's economy into tailspin. Inflation surged, food prices soared, and the government found itself in a financial crisis. Desperate to maintain control, al-Bashir had no choice but to rely on the RSF's growing empire to keep his war machine running. By 2018, Sudan was on the brink of collapse. The economy was in ruins, and the streets were brimming with discontent. People had had enough. Protests began to spread, and al-Bashir's once invincible grip on power was finally being challenged. What started as a small protest against rising food prices soon exploded into a full-blown revolution. Students were the first to take to the streets, their voices growing louder with each passing day. Workers joined in, followed by entire cities, and soon Khartoum itself became a battleground for freedom. The people had one demand: the end of Omar al-Bashir's 30-year rule. For months, al-Bashir resisted. He unleashed the full force of the police and military, trying to crush the protesters. But the streets of Khartoum had become a wave of defiance, and the people weren't backing down. Despite the violence, the revolution only gained strength. Al-Bashir's regime, once feared and unyielding, was now on the defensive. The tipping point came on April 11, 2019. The military, which had once been al-Bashir's loyal enforcer, turned on him. Hemedti's RSF, once his allies, distanced themselves. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, a senior army officer, finally struck the decisive blow. Al-Bashir was arrested, and Sudan erupted in jubilation. People flooded the streets, waving flags and singing songs of freedom. But while al-Bashir's downfall was celebrated, the path to true democracy remained uncertain. The revolution was just beginning. General Burhan quickly stepped in to fill the void, with Hemedti following closely behind. They promised a transition to democracy, but not just yet. Instead, they formed the Transitional Military Council, TMC, in August 2019. Burhan took the role of chairman, with Hemedti as his deputy. The TMC was meant to be a temporary government, a bridge to the civilian rule. The agreement was clear. The military would hold power for 21 months, and then the civilians would take over from the remaining 18 months. But this was never going to be a true partnership. Burhan, representing the Sudanese armed forces, aimed to restore the military's dominance in Sudan. Hemedti, however, was determined to consolidate his control over the RSF and positioned himself as a true power broker of Sudan. As the months went by, the uneasy alliance between Burhan and Hemedti began to unravel. The question of who would truly hold power was looming large, and the stage was set for a confrontation. In the early hours of October 25th, 2021, just months before the civilian government was set to take over, The generals did what they had always done in Sudan's turbulent history. They staged a coup. Prime Minister Abdel Fattah, the face of the civilian government, was arrested. The fragile transition was shattered, and the civilian leaders were ousted from power. For a while, the military junta held firm, but tensions between al-Burhan and Hemedti began to boil over. The two men, once allies, were now on a collision course. Burhan proposed folding the RSF into the official army, effectively cutting Hemedti's private army off at the knees. But Hemedti wasn't going to let go of his empire that easily. The RSF had become more than just a military force. It was a powerful business empire, and Hemedti was determined to maintain control. The standoff came to a head in December 2022, when Hemedti decided that the only way to secure his future and his fortune was to take control himself. He had already built an empire on the backs of war, violence, and smuggling. He was not about to let Burhan strip it all away. The battle for power between the two military titans would push Sudan to the brink of destruction once again. On the morning of April 15, 2023, a storm of violence descended upon Sudan. Hemedti, the leader of the RSF, launched an audacious assault on General Burhan. The commander of the Sudanese Armed Force launched an audacious assault on General Burhan, the commander of the Sudanese Armed Forces. With 2,000 heavily armed men, Hemedti aimed to wipe out his rival in a single brutal blow. But the plan unraveled before it could be completed. Burhan, narrowly escaping death, left behind a scene of horror as 35 of his guards were killed in the bloody skirmish. What began as a failed assassination quickly spiraled into something much more catastrophic. The capital, Khartoum, became a war zone as bombs rained down from the sky. Shells tore through buildings and firefighters erupted in the streets. Within hours, the violence spread across the country, igniting a full-scale war. Khartoum, once a thriving metropolis, was now reduced to rubble. Thousands fled for their homes, and millions more were left to endure the chaos. The Sudanese armed forces, overwhelmed by the onslaught, was forced to abandon the capital and retreat to Port Sudan, leaving the RSF to tighten its grip on power. Airports were seized, government offices overtaken, and the RSF moved swiftly to dominate Sudan's strategic centers. The echoes of genocide from decades prior seemed to haunt the country once more as fighters loyal to Hemedti and his allies unleashed terror on innocent citizens. Villages were massacred, homes were set ablaze, and entire communities were erased from existence. Sudan, a country already scarred by decades of wars, now found itself on the brink of a new nightmare. As Sudan tore itself apart, the world watched with bated breath. Sudan's location, straddling the crossroads between North Africa, the Horn of Africa, and the Middle East, makes it a geopolitical prize. The country controls a vital Red Sea shipping route, a lifeline for global trade, and its strategic position cannot be ignored. While Sudanese civilians are caught in the crossfire, foreign powers have quietly moved in, eager to stake their claim on the country's future. In recent years, the Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE, have poured billions into Sudan, securing interests in agriculture, ports, and more. Meanwhile, Russia has eyed Sudan for its potential to establish a military foothold in the region, with reports of negotiations for a naval base on the Red Sea. But as Sudan descended into chaos, alliance with the Gulf fractured. Saudi Arabia, eager to limit Iran's influence, quietly sided with Burhan and the Sudanese armed forces. The UAE, however, found itself backing the RSF and Hemedti. Despite the rivalry between the two Gulf powers, it was a high-stakes game, not just for Sudan, but for control over the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, critical waterways that shape the region's power balance. Amid this complex tangle of foreign interests, Egypt also entered the fray, reportedly bombing RSF's position in April 2023. Though Egypt officially denied involvement, satellite images told a different story. What began as a localized conflict between two generals has now drawn in foreign powers with competing interests, making Sudan the focal point of a larger geopolitical struggle. At the heart of Sudan's conflict lies a resource that has long been a source of both wealth and violence: gold. The RSF controls Sudan's vast gold mines, tapping into one of the richest sources of income in the country. But it's not just the RSF benefiting from its illicit trade. The UAE has become the primary buyer of Sudan's smuggled gold, turning the country's wealth into a powerful engine for war. In 2022, the UAE imported a staggering $2.3 billion worth of precious metals from Sudan. Much of this gold was trafficked, laundering money, and fueling the conflict that continues to rage. But this gold is not just being used to fuel Sudan's internal war. In 2024, reports surfaced revealing that UAE was supplying the RSF with arms through neighboring Chad, further intensifying the violence. The RSF's gold trade was funding more than just local conflicts. It was contributing to a much larger global network of violence and exploitation. But Sudan's war took an unexpected turn when Ukraine became a player in the conflict. In September 2023, reports emerged suggesting that Ukrainian special forces had launched drone strikes on RSF positions near Khartoum. Some saw it as a form of retribution for Russia's role in Ukraine's invasion. Others viewed it as a warning to the mercenaries supporting the RSF. Whatever the motive, Sudan was now an unexpected battleground in a much wider global conflict. As the war in Sudan drags on, the human toll grows ever more devastating. Millions of innocent Sudanese have been displaced, their homes and lives shattered by the violence. The conflict has sparked one of the largest refugee crises in the world, with over 12 million people forced from their homes. That's a population greater than Belgium, with families torn apart and children wandering through refugee camps in search of safety. The violence has not only displaced millions, but left half of Sudan's population, over 25 million people, facing crippling food insecurity. The war has ravaged agricultural production. The United Nations has called Sudan's crisis one of the worst humanitarian disasters in recent history. But despite the widespread suffering, the world's response has been slow and insufficient. Sudan is now in a state of catastrophe. Its people are starving, its cities are in ruins, and its future remains uncertain. The international community has failed to intervene meaningfully, leaving Sudan's fate in the hands of warring generals and foreign powers jockeying for influence. What started as a battle for power between two men has escalated into a disaster of monumental proportions, and the world is left to watch as a nation staggers on the edge of annihilation.